What is going on, OWS Fam, YouTube Fam, DFS Fam? Welcome back to another edition of the DFS Lab. I am your host, JM to Win from oneweekseason.com. Joining me in a moment will be Keegan, KTM128. We will be building a roster, taking an early look at this week 6 slate. Quick announcement before we get started. We're scrapping the Wednesday show moving forward, just some scheduling conflicts on my end. So we're going to start doing Thursday, Saturday for Draftkings with Keegan and me, and then still the Friday show with Mike for FanDuel. So with that, let's get started.
1 week season.
Keegan, how you doing, man?
Doing great. Doing pretty
So
good.
before we got in there, you said you didn't get a chance to play last weekend. I told you probably weren't missing much.
Yeah. I mean, like, it always sucks to, not being able to play it. But I was like scrambling the morning of to punch everything into the optimizer and see if I get that 150. I have yet to do a 150 max entry.
Yeah, so it was really, in my opinion, sharp on your end to not play because you said, basically Saturday night got crunched and then Sunday morning you woke up and tried to put everything together and you were like, I don't know that this is as sharp as I need it to be. And so, with the time crunch, so you just stopped. I think a lot of people would still continue to pursue that play because they want some action in play. And obviously there's that outside shot that things come together, but it's probably negative expected value to throw something in at the last minute and not have the full time to think through it. So over time, that's a decision that saves you money. I guess I can't say makes you money because you didn't play, but decision that saves you money, which is the same as making money if you would have lost money. So I think that's a sharp call on your end. You still able to get some parlays in play this last week?
Yeah, man. I was very close to winning quite a few of them. Half of them was because Anthony Richardson, I was very long on him hitting that passing yards, and he was definitely on his way for it. Like, get 98 in the first quarter and a half. So, and then he got injured, and I was like, man, that sucks. On one of them, I had just a 2-leg with Justin Fields who would hit. I think it was that Thursday night, and then
nice.
And then Anthony Richardson was all I needed. And we paid $250, and I was like,
yeah, I was thinking about that the other day where there were some, I've had a few this season, like Mike Williams over 4.5 catches against Minnesota, where he did get hurt in that game, but got the catches first. I had one, I forget who it was, but I had somebody last week who was anchoring a lot of my plays. And then I had one where it was like Kenneth Walker over 12.5 carries, a week or two ago, at the end of the first quarter of their game, and Underdog had him at 12.5 carries for the rest of the game because he had only 1 or 2 carries to that point. And it was but Seattle had a lead and Kenneth Walker wasn't hurt. And so you get those that are really obvious and they hit, but then you always think what's going to suck is if one of these guys gets hurt, the really obvious guy gets hurt and you don't get that anchor where you're like, oh, this is obviously none of them are going to hit 100% of the time, but you can find those bets that's 65, 75% of the time they're going to hit. And so you put those on a bunch of your parlays and then the guy gets hurt. And it's all of those are lost. So, those are the breaks of it. And the hardest thing then is just the mental side to bounce back and not let that, to not try to chase those losses, right? To not be okay, I'm going to I should have made this amount of money last week. So now I'm going to up my buy-ins and whatever else, but just keep hunting for those edges. So yeah, those are the breaks of this world. It's funny, that made me think. I was in Nashville one time for a Roto Grinders party of some sort, and we were at this rooftop bar in Nashville, and there was this guy there. It was when I had the man bun and the beard, and there was a guy there who also had a man bun and a beard, and so everybody started calling him JM number 2, and we were joking around with him, and he literally couldn't. He thought that we were all messing with him, telling him what we all were there for and what we all did for money. He just thought that none of this was true because it is sort of a weird thing that we all do. Looks like we lost you on the internet. So that is some problems that we've been having. I know you ordered that Ethernet, probably not there yet because you got the Mac with the USB-C connection. So with that, I will actually go ahead then and open up a roster on mine. Oh, Keegan, you're back. There we go.
Yeah. So, quick thing. Even with the Ethernet right now, my internet is acting up. I have two separate Wi-Fi's, I guess you could say. So I switched to the other one. Hopefully, it will last me this show. I think I need to call somebody out here though. And
yeah, it's. I mean, it's one of those like nothing you can do things, right? Like I don't know how many shows I have each week, but it's pretty critical for me to have internet that's up and running, and mine is pooped out on me back-to-back weeks, right before, right during my show with Pete. So it is what it is.
So somebody asked, I think 2 weeks ago, maybe, what like app I use for prop bets. I use, I think 3 to 4 separate apps, just because like there's different lines on each app, and try to find the best optimal line. But mainly I use like Prize Picks, and then sometimes Sleeper Picks, just because they have such an enticing multiplier on some of their picks. Like for a touchdown, if somebody's probably going to get a touchdown, or like more likely to, it's like ×2 for just one pick, and that's pretty nice payout if you hit it. And then with Prize Picks is nice because of the correlation that you can do. So like a lot of these apps don't allow you to correlate the quarterback with the receivers for like the passing yards and receiving yards, but Prize Picks is actually, they let you do that. So it's a pretty nice little.
Yeah. Like the volume, to me, volume is the most predictive thing. Like it requires the fewest things to go right. And Underdog no longer lets you have quarterback passing attempts and wide receiver targets, because those are so directly correlated. So yeah, and that actually brings up, and I don't do the editing for these videos, but they might be able to throw up a link at the bottom of this screen. If not, you can go to 1 week season and go to the promo codes tab in fact, let me at least open this up and share it with you guys. If you come here and go to promo codes, you'll have our promo codes for Underdog, for Prize Picks, for Drafters, for Sleeper, for Thrive. And what Keegan said is super sharp, right? And I've talked before, if you're not on OWS, if you just watch this show, there's so many people, like I know multiple millionaires who will like go out of their way to get the $100 deposit bonuses on these sites. And they'll be like, oh yeah, I'm only playing on this site right now because I got this $100 deposit bonuses. And it's that mindset of like every little bit of free money, every little edge you should be trying to scoop up. So one of the things we always encourage is don't just have an Underdog account or a Prize Picks account because you've already used your deposit bonus on that account. So also sign up for these other sites, because every time that you get this $100, $200 deposit bonus, whatever it is, that's free money that you're able to take advantage of, and that's able to multiply your bankroll. And then, like Keegan said, there's different payout structures, there's different bonuses, there are different lines on different sites, different apps. So maximize the number of apps that you're using. It's the sharpest way to go. You're going to make a lot more money by doing that. So yeah, good call there. Also, piggybacking off of that, Keegan said that somebody asked that in the comments. If you have questions, drop them in the comments. Things you want us to talk about on future shows, drop them in the comments. Also, obviously, as you always hear on YouTube, drop a like on this video because that helps with the algorithm. So, but yeah, drop comments if you have questions or have anything you want us to talk about. With that, Keegan, do you have any kind of opening thoughts on this week's slate before we start building a lineup?
Yeah, so I have a question about this slate. I feel like there's a lot of game scenarios that I think a lot of people are going to jump on. Are there any that aren't obvious, that are almost invisible, that you've noticed? Because everything that I've seen, I'm like, man, this looks great on paper, but is there something? Because like there might have been a week, I don't remember which week, but I remember like watching the Red Zone and seeing one of the teams that I wasn't even like thinking about. And we talked about this last week about how you look at like every single game and you're like, well, can this game blow up? Can this game blow up? And are there any games this week that are like almost invisible that might have a chance of doing something?
That's an awesome question. So I don't know that there are necessarily games that are invisible that could blow up. I think what's more interesting is the perceptions around some of these games are probably going to be skewed off what they really are. And so I would think that most people will look at Seattle and Cincinnati and be like, man, this is a dope game. And yet both teams are implied to score under 24 points. So the way I framed it in my DFS interpretations, which aren't actually on the site yet, but I've written up that one. The way I framed it is this is like, we can't just look and say, oh, well, the median outcome is actually a lot lower than the field is going to think. So that's the starting point, right? The field is just going to look at this game and be like, oh, this game could shoot out. And yet Vegas is telling us that the median outcome in this game is that it's not shooting out. And yet it can shoot out, and it can shoot out to a had to have it level. So we can't just be like, oh, well, 50% or more of the time it's going to finish with this sort of disappointing output. So we'll just fade it and let everybody else chase it, because people could chase it. And then in the small sample size of this week, it could go in that direction. So that's something we have to be aware of, is it's not like people are wrong on that spot. They're just overconfident on that spot. Same thing with Minnesota and Chicago. When you lose, yeah, see, and I think that's like, people are going to gravitate toward it. But when you lose one of the best players, maybe the best player in the NFL, or maybe the best skill position player in the NFL, it dramatically changes your ability to do great on offense. On top of that, Minnesota, one of the top rushing offenses in the NFL by yards before contact per attempt, adjusted line yards, DVOA. And so would it be a total shock? We know that they're one of the highest pass rate over expectation teams, but would it be a total shock if they're like, let's run the ball a little bit more this week? So things like that are interesting. Also, the Minnesota defense, they're really not, the narrative is they're awful. They're actually more middle of the pack, and have been middle of the pack since kind of early in the season. And Justin Fields, back-to-back smash weeks, but against two of like the bottom three pass defenses by DVOA. Minnesota's kind of middle of the pack. So that's a game similar to the other one where the high end is as high as people are going to think, but people are going to be overconfident in it. So that does open opportunities. Like I said, it's not like we have these games where you say, oh man, like everybody thinks this game's going to go off, and it's probably not. Like everybody thinks it's going to go off, and it still very much could. So it doesn't just mean we can fade that and go in a different direction, but it does open the door for kind of looking for other spots. So in terms of games that could blow up, we know that shootouts tend to develop from explosive players hitting quickly. So one of the greatest examples we've had in recent memory was, I believe the final score was 42-38 between the Ravens and Dolphins last year. And it was week 2. The over-under on the game was like 42 points. So super low over-under. Nobody was paying attention to that game. Most of the players in that game were like 1% to 2% owned. And OWS members had a huge week that week, because we always talk about shootouts develop from explosive players hitting for explosive plays. And there were a bunch of people on OWS who were like, oh, well, Miami has a bunch of explosive players. Baltimore has explosive players. This game could shoot out. And they just, instead of taking one-off pieces from that game, they built around that game with 3, 4, 5 pieces from that game. It ends up being this monster game, and the only monster game on the slate, and you make a bunch of money. So I don't see a lot of other games, like Detroit has a really good offense, but they're not an explosive offense. Arizona or the Rams, and actually Arizona. Rams obviously have a really good offense. Arizona has a better than people realize offense, but not necessarily explosive offenses. And then, so I think that the game that's probably most interesting, most likely to go overlooked is this Washington-Atlanta game. You can't run against Washington as well as you can pass against them. They're bottom of the league in pass defense DVOA. 3 of their 5 games so far have combined for 60 or more points. 4 of their 5 games, they've given up 30 or more points to their opponent. At the same time, Atlanta tends to create lower scoring game environments. So you have kind of this tug in both directions of, Atlanta's going to try to pull this game down while Washington's going to give opportunities for this game to fire upward. So it would kind of take Washington really shutting down the run, similar to what Houston was able to do last week. And then that would lead to Atlanta saying, okay, fine, we'll throw the ball. We'll put it in Desmond Ritter's hands. Desmond Ridder at home, which I don't know if you've seen this stat, but he's going back to college. He's 31-0 at home, has never lost at home in college or the pros, and has been significantly worse on the road. So Desmond Ridder at home against Washington, that stat might be noise, but it is a very interesting stat. And that's a game that could exceed expectations, but it's not like it could be a 42 to 38 game. So yeah, I'm not really seeing a game like that this week, but that's actually, I mean, a tremendous question, because our thoughts should always go in that direction of what could be the outlier type of game.
Right. And so I got two separate things here. One's maybe like more of just a thought, and the other's a question. So like you said, with the reason I asked that question in the first place was because I think some certain games stood out to me so much. And I'm like, man, I immediately look at this slate and I'm like, this game, and this game, I got to obviously start to build a lineup for these games. And I mean, nothing's wrong with that. But then I start thinking, I'm like, man, what other games are there? And everybody else is going to be having the exact same thoughts as me. Like when you first like look at the slate. And then secondly, earlier you had mentioned about Minnesota maybe running the ball a little bit more. And I think it's funny that you mentioned that, because Kirk's line. So I'm really into prop bets right now, but Kirk's passing yards line is like 240, and his usual is around 280 to 300 for this entire season. Vegas is super sharp, obviously. Like it's their job to figure out, where they're going to be at the line. Do you think it's ever a good idea to look at some of these lines on these apps and maybe carry that over to DFS maybe? And
yeah. So there's definitely value in that. And, we can talk about props being an inefficient market, right? And we opened our props insider package this year. We opened it for MLB and tennis and golf. So we have, last year we made over $9,000 just in NBA alone. This year we've made almost $10,000 and NBA hasn't tipped off yet. So you could look at that and be like, oh, well, but there's edge there, right? At the same time, that's at $100 a bet. That's we're at like plus 98 units. And that's like a 2% to 3% ROI, which means there's thousands of bets and we're up like 100 bets on it. So one way to look at this, I used to hear this argument of like, well, props are inefficient. You can beat props. And so you really shouldn't use props for your decision making. But at the same time, like, yeah, props are beatable, but like across a massive sample size. If you put in thousands of bets and you're going to be like 100 over, the total number of bets that you put in, or whatever the case is. So yeah, props, Vegas isn't going to be perfect on props, but they're going to generally be sharp on props. And even the DraftKings pricing algorithm is really sharp. So part of that obviously comes into play with what recent ownership has been. Like a guy like Kenneth Walker, who's actually top 20 DraftKings points 3 times in his entire career. All 3 times he's done it, he's gone to 30 plus, but he's only top 20 DraftKings points 3 times. He's 6,700. He's overpriced, but people always roster him. So the DraftKings pricing algorithm also kind of keeps his price higher because of that. But generally speaking, like, yeah, there are things we can look at and say, like, wherever the props are, that should be a signal to us. Wherever the, like Vegas is saying it should be difficult for you to decide whether or not Kirk Cousins goes over 240 passing yards. So that doesn't prevent him from going for 300 plus, but it just means the chances of it are a lot lower than in other spots on the season. And so, yeah, I definitely like looking at props, and I use that. And every once in a while I'll use it to say, okay, well, they're wrong on this particular guy. Right. Like, and then if I feel that way, then I go kind of heavy on that. Like I had a bunch of Tank Dell over 3.5 catches last week. He ended up getting concussed. And so that was one that broke a bunch of my parlays, but that was one where I was like, oh, he's going to get more than 3.5 catches if we played out this game over and over again. And so I'll just take this as a bad line and then bet that. But yeah, that's a very sharp way to kind of gather in some extra information. I think that the one thing I would say on top of that is that everything in our decision-making should be about pulling in just like a ton of data points. So it's not about like, okay, here's one data point and this now makes this decision for me, but that is a useful data point to pull in and kind of put into the bucket alongside whatever else you're looking up. And then also, we got to keep in mind that is the median outcome. So we're not targeting median outcomes on our rosters. We're targeting outlier outcomes. So Kirk Cousins could throw for 360 and 4 touchdowns, and maybe that happens once out of every 50 games in this spot. And that line of 240 is still right? Maybe half the time he finishes below 240. But, when he goes to the upside, he can go way to the upside. So you still got to keep that in mind. But Yeah, that's definitely a data point that is useful, because if you're like just really high on a player, and you're like, I don't see how this guy can fail, and then you see that their prop line is very different than that, then it can be like, oh, maybe this guy can fail a little bit more than I was thinking.
So, yeah, I love that. When we're talking about outliers as well, what about when there's so Tyreek, right? He's got his line is usually 90 to 100 receiving yards each week. What about when they put it at like 110, 105? I've never seen that, but I'm just saying, like, do you look at that and then you're like, okay, this is a crazy line. Obviously, I may or may not bet this on props, but maybe I should go like relook at this game and see why they're putting it that high.
I've had that before, not so much at that high end, because at that high end, let's say Tyreek is typically 95, and then he's up to like 105. Mm-hmm. That's still, like, percentage wise, that's not that big of an increase. It would be more if a guy is like typically 42 yards and all of a sudden he's at 65 yards. Or one of the best examples of this was all the way back in 2015, but back then you never played opposing offenses at Seattle. And it was the Texans were playing at Seattle. Maybe it was 2016. The Texans were 2017. Texans were playing at Seattle, and the over-under was really high. And I said, for my NFL Edge right up that week, I said, I'm not sure why the over-under is so high, but let's dig into the research and see if we can figure it out. And then I went through like all the research, and I still couldn't figure out why the over-under was so high. And then I basically said, okay, like, none of the research is telling me why, but we want to account for this and like be aware of this in our approaches to the week. Cubs fan, who owns a chunk of OWS and is one of the sharpest DFS players in the world, Cubs fan basically took that game and said, I don't know why the over-under is so high. And it was actually creeping up throughout the week. It opened at like 48 and then crept up to like 51. But he said, okay, well, because this over-under is so high, and because most people will say, well, I don't know why it is, so I don't play pieces at Seattle. So he just stacked like 50 rosters around that game and ended up winning the Millie Maker that week, right? So there is that opportunity to say, I don't know why this is set up this way, but I can take this data point and use it to my advantage and recognize, same as you said, like the games that are going to stand out to us when we first look at the slate, those are typically going to be the same games that are standing out to everybody else. Mm-hmm. Similarly, the spots where you're like, I don't see why this guy's line is where it is, most people are going to look at it that way and won't play that player. Or I don't see why this game total is where it is. Most people will look at it that way and not play those players. So that gives us an opportunity to just say, well, let me leverage this data point. Maybe it won't work out this week, but that tells us that it's plus expected value, plus EV, that if we could play out that slate 100 times, leaning on that data point where everybody else is ignoring it, we're going to be positioned to make money off of those things. So yeah, I mean, I love stuff like this, where it's like, where can we find little edges? And this builds off of what we talked about last week on the show, where, you were talking process, and I was saying, pull in like extra information and kind of find these extra things you can balance into your thoughts. So these are all extra things that you can balance into your thoughts that can help you outmaneuver the field a little bit better.
Awesome. Thank you for the insight. I really appreciate that. And I'm going to try and use that towards my DFS.
Nice. All right. So do you want to open up your DraftKings?
Yeah. Share that screen. Do that.
Well, we can build a roster. And while you get that set up, that also, like, just another note on that is that we also want to remember that DFS is not about just picking players, right? It's also still about how we put our rosters together and what stories we're telling and how we really take advantage of the opportunities that are available to us so that we can kind of maximize the money that we make when things go our way. So the picking players, we can get so hung up on that it can get in the way of us building sharp rosters, but people who just use projections and game theory tend to make more money than the people who focus on players. So what we want to do is take our superior knowledge of players and then marry that to better rosters. So with that, let's dive in and build a roster. So it's an interesting week, because like you said, there are games that stand out to you when you open the slate. And I felt the same way. And even going through the wide receiver pool, right? I mean, Tyreek Hill's not in a great matchup. Does that matter? Probably not, right? Because Carolina hasn't seen the speed of this offense on the field yet. Carolina is going to give up points. But Tyreek Hill's not in a great matchup, but he can hit for a big game. Cooper Kupp, is typically going to score between 26 and 40 points most of his games. And he's back in, he's healthy. He's in this role. Jamar Chase, obviously his value goes down a little bit if T. Higgins is back this week, but Jamar Chase still could see 12 to 15 targets if T. Higgins is there. And then obviously if T. Higgins is out, Jamar Chase is a really nice play. Devontae Adams is, not in the best matchup against the Patriots, but the Patriots dealing with a lot of injuries. Devontae Adams is still capable of putting up 40 pointers. Puka Nacua probably can't get to 40, but he can get to 30. A.J. Brown, not in a good spot against the Jets, but he can blow up and go for 35 to 40 points. Amon-Ra St. Brown, not in a great spot against the Bucs, but we know that he can blow up for 35 plus points. Jalen Waddle, same thing. And you go down the list, there are a lot of pass catchers. And then you even get down to the 6K range. Calvin Ridley went for 27 last time he played Indy. He could do that again or go for more than that. DJ Moore, put up 30 and 50 in his last 2 games. So he's capable of that. So there's just a lot of places on this slate where it's oh, there's some ceiling here. And then you kind of scroll down a little more and you're oh, there's some ceiling here. There's some ceiling here. So if you kind of start the way that the typical sharp DFS players do, where you start from game totals and game environments, you can kind of look at this slate and be it's a little bit ugly. But if you start from the player side, which is where I'd say that most casual DFS players start from, but I also lean more toward I tend to open up the app and I go game by game, but through the players, So I tend to have that blend of yes, game environments, but also players. And I don't look at over-unders till later in the week. And if you look at the slate that way, it is there are some spots where you're ooh, this is attractive and this is attractive and this is attractive. So I like this slate because there's a nice mix of the game totals tell us it's not a great slate, and yet there are some spots that could end up being really nice this week. So with that, kind of thoughts from you, and then where do you want to start this build?
Yeah. So I'm pretty sure. I mean, originally I was gonna have 2 options, but I really think today I want to talk about the Jets-Eagles game.
Interesting.
What we can do with that.
Okay.
My first thought is as a bring back, I don't know if we can afford all this just because the Eagles pieces are so expensive, but having Garrett Wilson just on there as a bring back, I feel would be pretty valuable, solely because, obviously he's still probably going to be decently owned, but at the same time, I think not as many people are going to be on him because of his game last week against the Broncos.
Yeah. Well, and also, if you flip through his game logs, he's from last year. He's never posted a useful game with Zach Wilson under center. So that in itself is enough to make most people be I probably don't want to go here. At the same time, we know that Zach Wilson has looked better. We also know that Eagles are number 1 run defense DVOA. They still have Fletcher Cox in the middle. They added Jordan Davis. Last year, they added Jalen Carter. This year is on track to be Defensive Rookie of the Year. This is not an easy run game matchup. And so then you expect, especially if you're building around the Eagles passing attack or the Eagles side of this game, you're expecting the Eagles to put up points, force the Jets to throw the ball. So I actually think that's really sharp. And I think that most people have enough respect for the Jets defense that I don't think you'll compete with much ownership on this type of setup. What's interesting about it is that we can look at it and say, we can look at the research, which is what most people do, and just say, oh yeah, this isn't the best spot for Jalen Hurts and AJ Brown or Devontae Smith or whoever it is to hit. And yet, if we played out this slate 100 times, wouldn't there be some times where the Philly offense does really well in this spot? So I think it's actually a really sharp tournament angle where instead of just starting this roster and saying, what are the sharpest on paper plays, we start a roster and we say, what's something that could hit and the people won't be on. And I'm also assuming that you're not just going straight game theory here, but you're also oh no, I kind of like this spot, which is the best way to build it, is when you're oh, I actually like this spot and people aren't on it. And you're aware that it's not as good of a spot as some of the others, but it's a better spot than most people are going to realize. And so, it's an interesting setup. So on the Eagles side, how would you want to attack this roster?
So, I'm more of a casual player, so this is a question for you. Dallas Goedert. So last week, I'm pretty sure the coach said that they were going to start using him more, and obviously last week they did. Are they going to continue that, or was that just a one-game fluke?
Yeah, so the actual, not the quote, but the actual, what Nick Sirianni actually said was he'd been asked kind of week in and week out about Dallas Goedert. And what he was saying last week was the offense flows through A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, and Dallas Goedert. And he was saying, like, that's the way it was last year. It's no different this year. That's just not the way that basically, what a lot of these teams will say is the ball goes to who the defense tells you the ball should go to. And so you drop the play for Dallas Goedert, but he's covered, and A.J. Brown's the number 2 read on that play. So and he's open, so you go to him. Or A.J. Brown is the number 1 read, and he's open on that play, so you go to him. So basically that it goes back to what we brought up over and over again about Dave Canales in Tampa saying you don't design plays for Kate Otten. You design plays for Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. So take this Eagles offense. They're designing plays for A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, and Dallas Goedert. So Dallas Goedert hitting is not a fluke. Dallas Goedert hitting is a situation of them designing plays for him. The fluke was more that he hadn't hit to this point in the season. So does that mean that he hits again this next? And then they asked Sirianni about it again this week, and he basically was like, "Listen, guys, like nothing changed. Like Goedert's part of our game plan. The offense flows through him. It just hadn't happened yet." So from that standpoint, I will say this probably means nothing, but I listened to this week's New Heights podcast, and Jason Kelsey was talking about how the one thing the Eagles still need to do is clean up their issues in the red zone. And Travis Kelsey said, just throw it to Dallas Goedert. So, maybe that's what they go with to solve their problems there. But no, it can feel point chasey, and that's almost a good thing because we're at a point in the evolution of DFS where if it feels super point chasey, people don't actually do it, right? What ends up happening is throughout the week, everyone's like, well, the field is going to play Dallas Goedert because he had a big game last week. And then it's like, nobody actually does that because he had a big game last week. So they're like, I don't want to just chase those points. Realistically, like I would say like this, his chances of hitting this week are the same as his chances of hitting last week. But also in week 4, those were the same chances of him hitting. So yeah, I mean, it could be, another, those sub 10-point games were sort of outliers for him, which it was each of the first 4 games were sub 10 points. Those were outliers for him. He's typically going to be in like the 9 to 13 point range, but he had a 27 pointer last year. And what was it this last week? It was a 28 pointer this last week. So like he's capable of those as well. So yeah, Goddard's a sharp play in that regard.
Yeah. And, we talked about it maybe like 2 weeks ago, how the tight end position this season has just been kind of dry. And every week, there will maybe be that one tight end that will get you that 25, 30-point game. And that could definitely win you the tournament.
Yeah, and anytime where you can pair it with your quarterback, that helps. And then we have a spot where probably have Sauce Gardner on A.J. Brown, which doesn't mean A.J. Brown can't catch some passes, but his chance of being like the engine of the offense are lower, and just a good all-around pass defense, so it makes it harder for Devontae Smith to hit. So yeah, Dallas Goedert is an interesting way to set up this pairing. And again, I don't think we'll see a lot of Jalen Hurts, Dallas Goedert rosters, and maybe Garrett Wilson, just because he's so cheap and so good, maybe he's on like 10 to 12% of rosters, but he's not going to be like a 20-25% owned guy. So you throw him onto this roster, and it tells a very comprehensive story that makes a lot of sense and will have really low combinatorial ownership. And then on top of that, it's possible that this combines for 90 points. Hurts can go for 32, Goddard can go for 28, Garrett Wilson can go for 30. And that's not the likeliest outcome for these guys. But if we end up with something like that, you have a low owned block that's not just like putting up a decent score, it's putting up a big score. And that can really separate you from the field. And then on top of all of that, if Goddard has a big game, he's separating from most of the other rosters who roster other tight ends, because most tight ends will disappoint. And they're getting you this score at like huge salary multipliers because Garrett Wilson's cheap and Dallas Goedert's cheap. So it's a really nice setup. It's not one that I've gotten to on my practice builds yet this week, but yeah, I like it. I like what it does. And again, recognizing, yes, it's not the likeliest thing to happen here, but it can happen. And if it does, you're in pretty good shape here.
Awesome. And just to get a better sense of our salary, I think we should probably go towards the defense. At glance, The first defense that caught my eye, like cheap wise, was the Patriots. But if there's any other ones lower than that.
Yeah, the optimizer was spitting out the Browns this week, which is, I think, great for us because the Browns are taking on this unstoppable force in the 49ers offense. And like, can the Browns put up 6 points? Probably, but like their chances of putting up 14 or something are really low. So that to me makes me want to jump to like, where is the defense that can put up 14 points? So yeah, New England is interesting. New England, they lost Matthew Judon, who's kind of the heart and soul of their defense, their best pass rusher. They lost Christian Gonzalez, who was the early favorite for Defensive Rookie of the Year at cornerback. And so they're not the same defense, but also these points they've been giving up, it's been more about Mac Jones than about the Patriots defense, right? It's all these like short fields or defensive touchdowns. So yeah, I think that the Patriots are a defense that could go overlooked against the Raiders, or like Patriots offense taking on a Raiders defense that is not in the same class as Dallas and New Orleans. So the chances of Mac Jones completely imploding are lower. I actually think Mac Jones is at least a little bit interesting this week in tournaments. The chances of him totally imploding are obviously lower, and therefore the chances of the Patriots defense being able to play their game are higher. So yeah, Patriots defense is one that I've looked at. Detroit defense for 100 more against Baker Mayfield that's an interesting one. Not a lot of defenses that like really stand out on this slate. So yeah, I like the idea of going with the Patriots and seeing what we have for salary, recognizing this is a practice build. We're kind of working through our thoughts, and there's always other places we can go at defense. But in terms of cheap defenses that are viable, that's one that we could definitely go to.
Yeah, and I actually forgot one of my practice builds I built, I think, on like Tuesday. I actually grabbed the 49ers.
Nice.
I was like, man, yeah, that's a great one. It was like 4K, and I was like,
yeah, it seems like Deshaun Watson's not going to play. Even if he plays, I don't know that makes a huge difference. You know what else with the Patriots? We not always, but we prefer home defenses because it is so much harder for we talk all the time about how the margins for error in the NFL are so small. The little things make such a big difference. And if you're playing on the road and you're going silent count, those tackles, you're going silent count because the center can't hear you, so the tackles definitely can't hear you. And so the tackles, instead of being able to hear the snap and react immediately, they're having to watch the ball. And so that gives like an extra, tenth of a second that defensive end has an edge on that tackle. So those things make a difference when you're playing. That's why defenses tend to do better at home versus on the road. At the same time, these Las Vegas games have often been kind of road games for the Raiders because they don't have a huge fan base in Las Vegas yet. Then you have a lot of, teams that travel well, Steelers, Packers, Patriots, Bills, like these teams with big fan bases, Cowboys nationwide, right? People will go to Las Vegas for a weekend to go catch this game. So I don't think that it's a bad, I don't know that Vegas will necessarily have to go silent count, right? That there's been a few instances of that this season where teams at home, the Rams at home or Raiders at home have had to go silent count. But yeah, it's definitely like more of a road game for Las Vegas than a typical home game for most teams.
Sweet. With that, let's do it. Let's pull the trigger. Boom.
Yeah, we've got Jimmy G playing too. We know he's going to make a couple hero throws that he has no right trying to make. So
interception here and there.
Yeah, a little interception here and there. All right, so we got some good amount of salary still left over. Obviously, running back is going to eat up some of that salary, so it might be interesting to see like what value we could find at wide receiver. Have there been any kind of cheaper pieces that you're interested in, or we could kind of go with like a more mid-range, like a more mid-priced roster across the board, because there is Amari DeMarcado with Arizona, who should be stepping into the lead role at 4,900 this week. We could go kind of 4,900 running back and some 5K wide receivers, but yeah, are there any cheaper guys that stand out to you this week?
I like Cam Akers, but I also who I've kind of been on a lot was Swift, but he's not really necessarily cheap. He's in that 6K range, and
it doesn't necessarily fit with this. Yeah. Well, I guess he could fit with this build. One of the things I dug up last week was that that basically like that Swift and Devontae Smith and Swift and AJ Brown were capable of hitting together, because it's just like the team is scoring a bunch of points. So he actually could fit on this roster. But yeah, I mean, yeah, let's go ahead and select our running backs, and then we can kind of see what we want to do at wide receiver, because we don't have to be restrictive as long as we're not going up to Christian McCaffrey. Like, kind of all the running backs are in similar price ranges, and not to say that any of these guys can't hit, but Christian McCaffrey obviously in a really tough spot against the Browns at his price tag. David Montgomery, a yardage and touchdown back, who's now in a tougher matchup than he had last week against Carolina, which is the worst run defense in football. Bijan Robinson, again, still typically getting around 19 to 20 touches and can hit for a big game, but like, can he go for 35 or 40? Probably not. So yeah, I mean, we're kind of in this, like, you get down to like the 7K and below price range at running back pretty quickly. Kind of make some of your decisions for you. So yeah, DeAndre Swift fits, and then we kind of go away from this game elsewhere on our roster and decide where we want to go at this next running back spot.
What's the situation with Miles Sanders? Does it look like he's going to be playing, or do we not know yet?
So the situation with Miles Sanders, they haven't said that his snaps and touches have been scaled back because of the groin injury. And then what was it? It was something else this last week. But yeah, I feel like Chuba Hubbard having more touches than Miles Sanders is more due to these injuries than to like the ineffectiveness of Miles Sanders to date. Yeah. At the same time, I mean, you're looking at a team that is 2 touchdown underdogs. It's going to be hard for Miles Sanders to put up a tournament winning game. And like, even when we're saving salary, especially in a position like running back, where it's like the difference between Miles Sanders and like some of these guys in the 6K range in terms of ceiling, it's pretty dramatic. So I want to try to avoid guys who are like, I'm saving salary and I'm like, hey, they can get me 15 to 20 points when, I'm passing up somebody who might be able to get me 30. So I would prefer Amari DeMarcado for 4,900 over Miles Sanders, or prefer kind of going up to another one of these 6K running backs.
Yeah, I'm totally cool with Amari. I think this like seems to be a negative part of my DFS play is I get caught up in the lower range. I do notice this always happens to me. I get confused on like where to go, even in receivers. I mean, receivers not so much, but a lot of like running backs, especially this season, I've noticed that once it gets like towards the cheap end, I really kind of just scramble for anybody.
Well, there's a very interesting like marriage of obstacles when it comes to running back, in that running back is the most projectable position. So when you take the off the board pieces, you're far less likely to hit than taking the clear and obvious pieces. At the same time, Mike Johnson and I were talking about, Mike Johnson, one of the contributors on OWS. He and I were talking about this a couple of days ago about over the last couple of years. Oh, no, it wasn't Mike. It was Stat ATL, one of our new contributors. He and I were talking about how many more 30-point scores come from wide receivers than running backs, which is a function of the way that the NFL has adjusted their approach to the running back position. And there was a whole like pricing swing that we went through where you never saw running backs priced above 8K. Then Le'Veon Bell and David Johnson came along and they were getting Christian McCaffrey Panthers workloads, right? They were getting 10 plus targets every game, plus the carries. And so their price tags kept going up and up and up. And finally we got these like 8,500, 9K running backs. And we had to adjust our thinking to paying that for running back. Well, then those guys got onto second contracts, the injuries were piling up. And all of a sudden teams started being like, okay, we're not doing the workhorse, do it all running backs anymore. We're doing split backfields. And almost every team, their lead back plays only about 65% of the snaps. And yet Draftkings has continued to price running backs at that range where we used to never see running backs priced. And so what we end up with is people are like, oh yeah, Bijan Robinson for 7,500 or whatever. And how many times is he going to crack 30 points? Not that many times. And so there's this thing where like the pricing is still the way it used to be at running back, and the roles at running back aren't the way it used to be. So if you actually go through the numbers, it's shocking how few 30-pointers come from running backs compared to wide receivers. So then there's this case to be made of like, well, you just pay down at running back and get the high priced wide receivers. But like we just said, running back's also super projectable. So like, you don't want to just take the guy who's not getting points when everybody else is getting points. So yeah, it's a very interesting setup at running back where, to me, anytime you can save salary on a guy with a role, then that's useful to do. It's one of the reasons I like Amari this week, because he's going to be on the field. Should be stepping into the James Conner role. And he's 4,900, right? So then I don't worry about, like, if he gets me 12 to 14 points, well, I'm freeing up salary for the more valuable wide receiver position. And then if he gets me 20, 25 points, he's probably matching a lot of the 6K guys, because there aren't that many 30-pointers that come from the running back position. So that's like a lot of, like I said, DFS is rarely dots on a line. It's more like, here's all the pieces, and we have to look at all of them. So that's kind of like a big picture, all the pieces at the running back position. But yeah, that's how I look at running back. And I think so. Yeah. Like, who are the sharpest plays this week? It's Travis Etienne, it's Bijan Robinson, it's Alvin Kamara, it's Kenneth Walker, it's Kyron Williams, it's Raheem Mostert, it's DeAndre Swift, right? It's all those guys in the 6K range who what their workload is going to be. They have touchdown opportunities. The guys in that group who miss will probably score like 14 to 16 points. The guys in that group who hit will probably score like 25 points. You won't have many, if any, had to have it scores. But yeah, so I kind of like just saying, well, if you go down to Amari and he gets you 14 or 15, you're still matching the bad guys from that range. If he hits for 25, you're matching the top scores from that range, and you free up the salary for the more valuable wide receiver position.
Awesome. Appreciate the insight on that.
Yeah. And so another way to frame that is just to say, like, it is dangerous to just like try to find value at running back, because if you get 4 points at running back and it's a bankable position where most of the high owned guys, somebody's 30% owned, somebody else is 15% owned, somebody else is 20% owned, and all those guys are scoring 15 to 25, and you get 5 points at that position, you're really behind the whole field. So you can't just like give up points at running back unless it's a really thin week with a bunch of high priced wide receivers who can hit. But you also got to be cognizant of not overspending at running back.
Right. So would it be the sharper play to take a cheaper receiver who has maybe a lower floor, but definitely a higher ceiling, rather than choosing a cheaper back? And going
and that's the other thing that like we've seen this year, right? Like Thielen hit for 34 points under 4K. Tank Dell hit for 28 points under 4K. We've had some other guys go for around 20 points under 4K. So yeah, if you can get the cheap guy who can get you the cheap guy who's just mispriced, right? Who can get you. And that was one of the things we kept saying about Wan'Dale Robinson last week, was like, he was mispriced very clearly, but he also had a pretty low chance of getting you 20 points. So it's not just the guy who's mispriced, but the guy who's mispriced and can get you 20 plus. Then that can kind of free you up to because it's harder to find the 4,500 running back who can get you 20 plus than it is to find like the 3,500 wide receiver who can get you 20 plus. So yeah, that typically is the way to go in terms of freeing up your salary to make everything work.
Okay. And I think with all that being said, we should still go with Amari DeMarcado, but maybe if we are tight on salary, we can pivot off of him and go with a cheaper receiver.
Yeah. And among cheap receivers, like there's the guys who can hit on like 2 or 3 targets, but we're still at a point in the season where there are guys who probably should be priced higher. So John Mechie is going to be filling in this week or we would expect he'll fill in most of the snaps for Tank Dell. Not a great matchup, but he's 3,100 and could see 6 or 7 targets. Trenton Irwin, saw 10 targets last week. If T. Higgins misses again, he's very viable. Jonathan Mingo, go ahead and open up Jonathan Mingo's 3,500, open up his game log and look at those targets for him on the season. I think he's a guy who's just going totally overlooked. And a lot of these are downfield targets. So, consistently seeing 5, 6, 7, 8 targets. He's a guy who will eventually hit for a big game. Jameson Williams, he's played 9 career games so far, and he has, I think it's 3 catches. So eventually that play is going to come together, but he's not like sharp on paper, but he can hit. Rashid Shaheed is another guy we could open up and just see, like, the targets aren't there at a high level, but the production is almost always there, where going back to last year, it's all these like 6, 8, 10, 20. Like then again, like another 7, 5, 8, 19, right? Like he's going to kind of score like that. Curtis Samuel is like hugely involved in this offense. 7 targets, 8 targets, 4, 3, 5. And not the best matchup, but again, same type of situation where he's on the field. He's going to see targets. Josh Downs with Gardner Minshew under center. We could see the Colts. Jonathan Taylor's there. Zach Moss is playing great. Like they could just run the ball a bunch, but also they're more willing to throw it 40 times with Gardner Minshew. He threw it 44 passes last time he started. So Josh Downs is interesting. So yeah, there's a lot of these cheap guys who can go for 20 points, and we're not just like firing total darts at bad plays and just hoping that something happens. So yeah, it definitely opens up a lot this week.
Yeah, maybe we could even go with a cheap back and a cheaper receiver and see if we can get a more elite expensive receiver.
Yeah, that frees us up to maybe target a pair of 30-point scores in our other 2 remaining spots. So yeah, is there any of those cheap wide receivers that stand out to you, or you want me to kind of pick one of them?
Man, you were throwing those at me so fast. I was just trying to type the names.
Let's go ahead and take a shot on
like
Jonathan Mingo because
cool.
it's a game environment that people are going to be on, and we don't seem to be on track here for a Dolphins piece. But then this basically allows us to say we're still betting on the Dolphins putting up points because then we're betting on the Panthers throwing in response and Mingo having an opportunity to put up points on his end.
Sweet. Okay. Yeah. The Dolphins defense does scare me a little bit, though. I think they're sneaky in the fact that they're better than some people think.
Well, yeah, and Bryce Young has played pretty poorly as well. So like, but at the same time, like if you're up, by 3 touchdowns, eventually you're kind of softening up the defense, and they're gonna be able to hit some stuff underneath and just pile up some yards. But yeah, and then it's interesting, right? Because if we go to like Jamar Chase, who's the guy everybody's wanting to go to, that constricts our salary. Although we might have, or I think we'll be 100 off from being able to go Jamar Chase, Jordan Addison, which would be like a super popular pairing this week, but we don't have to worry about that because so yeah, we're 100 off. We can always massage 100 in salary, at that last cheap wide receiver spot or something. We don't have to worry about what's popular because we started with this, like we said, this block of the Eagles and Jets that's not going to be popular and can put up a bunch of points. So yeah, I actually kind of like, obviously we're kind of assuming with this that T. Higgins is out. But if T. Higgins is out, this is actually a really nice setup. I would actually prefer keeping the Patriots because when you get to those cheap defenses, the drop-off can be pretty stark. And just going with a different cheap wideout is the way that I would want to do it. And I would be happy going down to I guess actually in this instance, we're saying that T. Higgins is out. So we could play Trenton Irwin and Jamar Chase together. Last week, Trenton Irwin, obviously Jamar Chase had like a career game, but Trenton Irwin had 14 points. He had 10 targets. He had 8 catches. Jamar Chase had over 50 points. They combined for like 65 plus points. So they're capable at, 11K in combined salary of combining for 45 points. That wouldn't be particularly surprising. So we could go there or go with John Mechie. But yeah, this gives us a nice setup because we grab 2 of the sharpest wide receiver pieces, Jordan Addison with Justin Jefferson out, Jamar Chase, assuming that T. Higgins is out, getting all the targets again, with the spillover going to Trenton Irwin. And then we have this bet on this Jets and Eagles game that is different from what the field will have and kind of separates us in that regard. So yeah, I like it. Any final thoughts on this roster?
Yeah, I mean, I do like that we have 4 pieces in that game. And I think that we're saying that it's going to be a very high scoring game. Hopefully not even necessarily that, but we're saying these pieces, Garrett Wilson gets a touchdown, maybe 80 yards. That would be great. 100-yard bonus would also be great. Swift, then they'd be up. Swift would run. Garrett Wilson would have to get more points. I like it.
Yeah. And if this ends up being like you said, we don't even need the Jets to do really well on offense. We need like a 31 to 14 point game would be fine. If the Eagles score 4 touchdowns and Goedert and Swift account for 2 or 3 of those, and Hurts is part of 3 or 4 of those, like we're in tremendous shape. And the Jets could score only 2 touchdowns or even only 1 touchdown, but Garrett Wilson gets the 100-yard bonus and gets that touchdown. Then all of a sudden we're in great shape. And on a week where there's not one game environment that really stands out, or one game environment that is like head and shoulders above the others. And like we said, like Seattle, Cincinnati will stand out to people. Minnesota, Chicago will stand out to people. And they are the best bets on the slate, but they're not as good of bets as everyone is going to assume, right? So if just both of those games finish more like 24 to 20, and then the Eagles score 4 touchdowns, we're probably way ahead of the field already. So yeah, it's an interesting setup. If I were building one roster on the weekend, this is obviously not like where my mind would go, but in terms of thinking through how we win a tournament, this is a really sharp build. And it's one of those where it's like, if I were hand building 100 rosters, I would want like 5 to 8 rosters that are kind of built like this, where you're just like, oh, this is a totally different game than other people are on, but it can hit and positions us for how do we win the most money when we are right? Instead of just like, how do we get the most things right? How do we win the most money when we are right? This is one of those where if we are right on this, we win a lot of money because most people just won't be on it. So yeah, sharp starting point, sharp roster, and I think allowed us to also kind of talk through some of the unique angles on this week 6 slate. So with that, I'll close this out. Keegan, thanks for hanging out. Listeners, viewers, thanks for hanging out. We will see you. We record our Saturday show on Fridays. So that goes up Friday night or Saturday morning. So we will see you back here again with that. We will see you on 1 week season throughout the weekend, and we will see you at the top of the leaderboards on Sunday.